Check 1 2 1 2. We're here at AJ Louden Studios inside the Timber co-work space, and we're about to do an interview. The caps, what they do is just like alter the spray cone. So when you press a button down on a can of spray paint, it sprays paint out that slowly kind of turns into a cone in the air, right? So if you want a more narrow cone, there are certain caps for that. And if you want a wider cone, there are certain caps for that. So basically, if you wanted to fill a big area really quickly, you'd use what's called a fat cap. And if you wanted to fill a small area with detail, you'd use a skinnier cap, which would allow less paint to come out at once. And then one more thing to play with is the angle of the can relative to the wall.
Are you interested in like text design in terms of graffiti?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm a big type nerd. I love typography and lettering and always researching different fonts and typefaces. And yeah.
It's fascinating how they could design how letters look for specific people, like kids' books or like children's education, whatever. Like it always has like very specific, like soft, bubbly text, and I always wonder like why is that the way it is?
Yeah, I'm really interested in that too. Yeah.
You were saying that like some graffiti out there, they should be considered artists or they should be paid for what they do.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, they don't, and even worse, they're seen as something quite negative. A lot of people don't like graffiti because they consider it vandalism. So there's, but it's inherently art, but there's such tension between that sort of art world and more quote unquote like elitist art worlds like galleries. Do you have like any experiences with those very different sort of art worlds throughout your career?
Yeah, I'd say my whole career is really like based on that tension in a sense. You know, like my background is in graffiti and street art. That's really like where I learned to paint at a large scale. And now as like a professional muralist, I see I have a lot of connections and relationships with people that work in traditional art settings, but I still have all my friends and other artists I respect and admire and I'm inspired by who work in like the graffiti world. Even since the 80s, we've had a lot of crossover actually. Like, you know, like there were artists from New York that were being flown out to Europe to exhibit in galleries like in the 80s and early 90s that came from the graffiti world, only working illegally without permission, and then all of a sudden we're able to cross over basically due to curation or other relationships within sort of the formalized fine art world. And so it's like not something that's super uncommon. And I think as we see graffiti just sort of become like a mainstay element of pop culture, I think it's something that we'll see more and more. You know, like there are institutions like the MoCA that have shown large-scale artwork from like internationally respected graffiti artists. And they've had like big shows, and graffiti, this modern version of graffiti using spray paint at least has been represented in, you know, like major galleries. Artists are having retrospectives at this point because it's just old enough that they've been painting for 30, 40 years, right? So yeah, I see that definitely happening. I think like here locally in Edmonton and in Canada, we're still like catching up a little bit culturally maybe in some of those ideas, but like there are a lot of people like Trevor and Annalisa behind Rust Magic Festival that are really like acting as the forefront, you know, like they're really like pushing the culture forward and like showing people how powerful this medium is, and then asking people to give it the respect it deserves too. So yeah, I see like a lot of change even in my own lifetime and career. The fact that I'm able to make a career and people are like, oh, you use spray paint like graffiti, right? And like it's a positive thing now, sometimes at least, right? So yeah, it's something I'm very interested in and think about a lot.
Do you have similar experiences with that, where there's any barriers with wanting to create art in a public space, and do you always need higher ups to like give you the green light or whatever?
Graffiti itself is proof that you don't need permission from higher ups. Like you can just go do it and make it. And it might not last forever, but nothing lasts forever. And one of the things about doing work in a way that's sanctioned versus a way that's unsanctioned, and that's a term I like to use a lot, is like sanctioned public art versus unsanctioned public art. And for me, it's like that sanctioning is great because often it represents getting some kind of financial support or at least getting like sort of the idea that you're not going to get arrested. You know, that could be helpful. But also it can be a bit of a handcuff too, because then people are asking you for a sketch beforehand, and then they might want to alter the vision a little bit, or the scope of where you're allowed to paint can become very limited.
You start to lose control.
Exactly.
And say,
Yeah, and so I think there is like a giving up, like you've said, a giving up of control in return for either finances or the fact you're not going to get arrested. And I don't think that we'll ever have graffiti in a state where it needs sanctioning all the time.
Right.
In fact, I think like one of the core tenets of like true graffiti in my mind is like, that's what's interesting about it, is that it is unsanctioned. But I think the word graffiti is like a little bit overstretched right now, because it's hard to know what somebody says somebody means when they say that word. Like I could be wearing a t-shirt that had some stylized lettering on it and you'd be like, oh, that's a dope graffiti t-shirt. But like, somebody didn't put that on my chest without permission. It's just the style of the lettering that you're referring to. And that is actually referring to an art movement that's happened basically since the late 60s, where people have been using spray paint in particular, but other mediums as well, to draw this very specific expressive form of lettering that maybe has roots in sign painting and calligraphy, but has also drove off into the territory of like illegibility sometimes. This, you know, an alphabet has like the form and it has a function as well, and those two things like work together. Like the letter A has a form and its function is to tell you what letter that is, right? But when you start to let like the style of it and the form sort of like outpace the function in a sense, and like you drop the function off a little bit, I think some interesting things can happen, and you can kind of challenge traditions around like, what is an A actually? You know, like what composes an A? Is it just a triangle? A capital A is just a triangle with a bar through it? Well, no, we've seen some other examples. So like, where are the boundaries of that glyph, that symbol? And I think like graffiti artists and typographers and other people experimenting with lettering and other people who love the alphabet are exploring those boundaries. But I like to think that graffiti artists are often exploring them maybe most aggressively and in new ways that maybe we haven't seen as often from other sources. I think sometimes people are too tied to legibility. I went to school for design as well, and I remember like that really being like the style du jour, you know, is like everyone wanted to do this very minimal, very pulled back, very reductive work, and then it feels like every choice that you make is very intentional and can speak a little louder, but sometimes like you can easily cut off too much and start to lose the soul of things a little bit.
Exactly.
You know?
I feel like that's like the biggest complaint or concern that a lot of people have who favor more maximalist things or more like, I think sometimes it gets political, and a lot of people who are complaining about this like quote loss of design.
Sweet. In the workshops that I teach a workshop series called Aerosol Academy.
I was going to ask you about that. Yes. How did that start, and like what exactly, why exactly did you do that, or if you're still doing it?
Yeah, I still do teach it occasionally. So that workshop series really started out of me thinking that there's needed to be like more thought, and I just like when I heard people talking about graffiti, it was often from an uninformed place. And then like often within the subculture of graffiti, people don't want to talk about it too much in public because some of it's like meant to be sort of like, or in the past was meant to be more insider knowledge. But then I started like just encountering other people like teaching or sharing or like reclaiming the narrative of graffiti within kind of pop culture and within like just contemporary art culture in general. I thought back to when I was a kid and I went to art school, not art school, I went to school, went to like elementary school and had art classes, and I just never really felt myself represented in those classes. You know, like I love art growing up, I was always drawing, but like art class wasn't actually my favorite class. You'd think it would be, but like it just like, it didn't really connect with me. I think partially because like we were always, maybe too often, just hearing the stories of like dead Europeans and like the valuable paintings that they made. And it just like didn't really connect to me personally. I was like interested in Ninja Turtles and like I wanted to draw cartoons and like that's what felt like creativity to me. And that's not really what we were engaging with in school as much. You know, there were times where we got to do that too. But then I like found graffiti in my own life, and it just like felt like the floodgates opened. I felt this connection to something that like meant something to me. You know, growing up I was interested in hip hop culture, and it's still something I'm super passionate about. And so seeing graffiti as this sort of visual arts arm of the hip hop set of cultural tools and you know, just hip hop culture in general, that made me like want to make graffiti more accessible and make just like the story of graffiti better understood by people who weren't practitioners maybe. And so I created that workshop series to like basically to try and find myself as a kid and teach them the things that I had to find out on my own. And then also just thinking about the future of it is like, how do we get people to see graffiti in a new way and to see street art and other unsanctioned public art in a new way? And for me, it's often starting with the youth, like letting them know that they are represented in the world in this voice of graffiti. And then maybe like when they grow up, they see it a little bit differently, and it's not something that's purely criminalized, but like maybe something that they can see value into and understand the artistry behind, and not think it's like just strictly gang culture that's doing graffiti, you know, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that was like a big impetus for me to start Aerosol Academy. That idea of like making art accessible for more people, because it just didn't feel as accessible for me as a kid when I was in school, you know.
And now you're exploring new mediums, hey?
Yeah, I've really been into textile arts lately. I was lucky enough to be an artist in residence at Fern's School of Craft.
Yes, I saw that, yes.
Yeah. And so like that's been a big influence on my practice.
Right.
And before that I was interested in textiles, but like not to this degree. So I had painted a few murals, one in particular like Clairview Station, that was like based on the idea of textiles being a symbol for culture, and that this big woven tapestry made of all these different patterns that represented different cultures. Painting that and then going to Fern's, I kind of like look back and I'm like, oh yeah, of course I would love this medium. How did I not ever come to this before, you know? And growing up, my mom was a seamstress. She owned like her own company where she would make like different cloths and mostly clothing. And so like just looking back again, I'm like, oh yeah, of course, you know, but.
So you're doing like a nice balance of the tufting stuff and painting still, or is you kind of like focused on one more than the other?
I would say like in terms of like the commercial practice of my studio, like what makes the money that allows me to kind of keep the studio open, it's definitely muralism and workshops and things centered around that side of my practice. And then the tufting thing, it was meant to be more of like a hobby at first. I was just like, cool, I want to do something creative that's not my job.
Right,
And then, you know, it's sort of starting to bleed into my job a little bit, which is like maybe, I think it's good, but I would also just like a hobby that doesn't feel like work sometimes. So I'm like, I'm still sort of negotiating that a little bit, right? So my name is AJ Louden, and I'm an artist focused on muralism. I also teach and share my knowledge about the history and culture of the art forms that I'm interested in. And recently I've really been into textile art too, so that's something new for me. I would say I'm like really interested in working in public places. I have a long history with graffiti and with street art, and I think artwork in public places, often unsanctioned artwork too, can really be a useful way for us to kind of have shared stories in public places, maybe challenge narratives in public places. And by working in public, the audience can have a different experience than you might have when you go into a gallery or another place where there might be some kind of barrier to entry. So by working on the street, it's very accessible for an audience. You can just walk up or you can drive by and see the art. And so that's one of the reasons I'm really interested in working in public. Not only through the content of the art, that's not really it, but just like the physical nature of the art. The fact that you don't need to feel comfortable in a gallery space to engage with this work, or comfortable in, you know, any kind of arts institution. You're just walking about your everyday life and you can encounter art. I think that's like a beautiful thing. Also, I think when you see art on the streets, it can maybe hit you in an unexpected way. If you go to an art show or something, you know you're going there to see art. But if you're just like walking and you go under a bridge and all of a sudden there's this explosion of color and story and identity, I think that's like something that's really important for us too, is not to have all of the art behind some kind of barrier or gate kept in some way. It's important to me because I see art in general as like a very collaborative activity. Like any type of art making is communal, and in so many ways. So like one example would be, for me, somebody that loves to use spray paint. There had to be a bunch of material scientists who put together a really optimized spray paint can that allows me to make the marks that I want to make, and it gives me access to more range of expression. So even just the fact that I'm like, in a sense, collaborating with these scientists who have created this like perfectly pressurized tube full of a well-curated color, that's part of the story for me. I feel like that's a collaboration on that sense. There's just so much human activity piled on top of itself when you get into any type of art making. And that to me means that all art is collaborative. Even the ideas that I have, you know, I might watch a movie or I might read a book, and then it might spark something inside of me, and that might inspire me to go do some creative act. or I might have a conversation with another artist locally that inspires me and drives me and motivates me to create something, just based on that conversation. So like everything that I do is collaborative and communal in that sense. There's no creative act that I've done in my life that was unconnected from the people around me. Because like strengthening these local networks and these in-person networks is something that's maybe more important than ever. I think we're at an interesting time in society where all of a sudden we have access to all these communication tools that allow us to make really deep connections with people on the other side of the planet. But maybe we're so excited about these new methods that we forget to connect to the people next door, or the people like us who are, you know, physically sharing space with us too. And so I think a project like Art From Here allows us to recenter some of those connections and make sure that we're connecting locally and that we're celebrating the others locally who are doing this work, you know, and who are excited about this work that we're excited about.